For 2 decades, Napoleon Bonaparte was the undisputed military genius of Europe, his name synonymous with crushing victories, continental domination, and the creation of a vast, seemingly unshakable empire that stretched from Spain to Poland. But the story of Napoleon's downfall is not one a single lost battle. It is a catastrophic tale of financial overreach and a profound economic miscalculation. A single, deliberate policy decision that proved more destructive to France than all the cannons of the Allied coalition combined. We are not talking about Waterloo. We are talking about the Continental Blockade, a financial and trade policy that Napoleon enacted to destroy his ultimate rival, Great Britain, but which instead became the primary tool for the economic suicide of his own empire. This blockade, which attempted to shut down all European trade with Britain, was an act of financial war that backfired with devastating, compounding consequences, costing France and its vassal states what would amount to over $100 billion in today's currency and ensuring the long-term financial collapse of Napoleon's grand design. If you understand this secret history, you will realize that Napoleon's march on Moscow was not primarily a military necessity, but a desperate financial move to enforce a failing trade policy, a journey dictated not by imperial ambition alone, but by a collapsing economic reality. This blockade, launched by the Berlin Decree in 1806, officially banned all trade, communication, and mail with the British Isles, declaring any British goods found on the continent to be lawful prize. Napoleon believed that since Britain was a nation of merchants and shopkeepers, cutting off its European export markets would immediately lead to financial ruin, mass unemployment, and force London to sue for peace, leaving France as the undisputed economic master of the world. He was wrong. Britain, possessing the world's most powerful navy and access to untapped global markets in the Americas and Asia, simply pivoted its trade, but the French Empire, reliant on land routes and less dynamic colonial trade, found itself strangling its own economy with its own law. The blockade became an ironic financial mirror, reflecting economic ruin back onto its architect. The most catastrophic financial effect on the French Empire was the loss of customs revenue. Before the blockade, tariffs and taxes on imported goods constituted a vital stream of revenue for Napoleon's military machine, funding his perpetual wars across Europe. But once trade with Britain was banned, this revenue stream dried up almost completely, forcing Napoleon to resort to increasingly aggressive and unsustainable methods of financing his government. He began demanding heavier tributes from his conquered states, forcing them to bear the cost of his armies, and selling off state lands, a financial practice that was fundamentally unsustainable and created widespread resentment across the Confederation of the Rhine, the Kingdom of Italy, and the Duchy of Warsaw. This shift from relying on trade revenue to relying on direct tribute turned his allies and vassal states into reluctant financial victims, pushing them closer to revolt and making the entire empire structurally fragile. This single, sweeping economic decree created an impossible dilemma across the continent, a dramatic contrast between Napoleon's imperial might and his economic incompetence. On one side, you had the massive, disciplined French army, capable of crushing any opposition, but on the other, you had the invisible, relentless force of market demand, which Napoleon arrogantly believed he could ignore. The average European citizen needed colonial goods, sugar, coffee, tobacco, and, most crucially, raw cotton for their burgeoning textile industries. And almost all of these goods flowed through the British global shipping network. When Napoleon banned British ships and goods, he didn't ban the demand. He simply created a massive black market and a smuggling epidemic that enriched criminals and Napoleon's enemies, while simultaneously devastating the legal customs revenues that financed his own army. This internal economic rot was immediately visible in the sharp decline of the French port cities. Bordeaux, Nantes, Hamburg, and Amsterdam, once bustling hubs of Atlantic commerce, became ghost towns, their docks silent, their warehouses empty, and their merchants bankrupt. The blockade starved these cities of the raw materials necessary for manufacturing and the colonial produce that sustained middle-class life, leading to mass unemployment and deep resentment against the Napoleonic regime. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, British ports were thriving, their ships navigating around the blockade to new, rapidly growing markets in South America and the Ottoman Empire, proving that Britain's naval power gave it the resilience and flexibility that Napoleon's land-based empire entirely lacked. Napoleon's fatal economic flaw was his belief that the economy was merely a tool of his military will, something that could be commanded and controlled by decree, but he was dealing with the unpredictable forces of supply and demand, which found ways to bypass his arbitrary rules. The price of essential commodities skyrocketed across Europe. For example, the price of sugar, which was vital for both consumption and the burgeoning alcohol industry, rose tenfold. And while Napoleon attempted to promote beet sugar as a domestic substitute, the infrastructure and yield simply couldn't compete with cheap colonial cane sugar. This high cost of living directly impacted the loyalty of the continental elite and the morale of the working class, leading to widespread corruption as officials took massive bribes to look the other way, allowing smuggling rings to flourish and further undermining the authority of the French government. The blockade created a system where financial lawlessness became the norm, destroying the very fiscal discipline Napoleon needed to maintain his empire. This economic failure directly drove Napoleon's aggressive foreign policy, illustrating how financial crisis can precipitate military disaster. As customs revenues plummeted and his vassal states grew increasingly reluctant to pay their excessive tributes, Napoleon needed new methods to enforce the blockade and find new sources of funding. This financial pressure was a primary factor in his decision to invade Portugal in 1807, which refused to comply with the blockade, and then the disastrous invasion of Spain in 1808, which quickly spiraled into the costly and draining Peninsular War. But the ultimate financial domino fell in Russia. Tsar Alexander I found the blockade crippling, as it devastated Russian exports of timber, grain, and hemp to Britain, costing Russia huge amounts of revenue and forcing him to resume trade with London in 1810. This resumption of trade was not an ideological move. It was an economic necessity for the Russian treasury, and Napoleon viewed it as an unforgivable financial betrayal. The resulting decision to launch the 1812 invasion of Russia, the military turning point of his career, was therefore fundamentally motivated by the need to financially enforce a failing economic policy and restore the blockade's viability. The $100 billion mistake in trade policy led directly to the military catastrophe in the snows of Moscow. The true financial depth of the disaster lies in the licensing system Napoleon himself was forced to implement, a humiliating retreat from his own policy. By 1809, recognizing the devastating shortage of raw materials and the crushing burden of lost customs revenue, Napoleon began selling licenses that legally allowed certain merchants to trade with Britain, a staggering admission that his economic policy was unworkable. These licenses were incredibly expensive, costing up to 40,000 francs each, and became another source of corruption and centralized power. But they never came close to replacing the lost revenue from legitimate trade, nor did they satisfy the widespread demand for goods. This system created a paradox. Napoleon was both the supreme enforcer of the blockade and the supreme smuggler, personally profiting from the very trade he had banned, further eroding the moral and financial authority of his imperial decree. This self-contradiction demonstrated that the needs of the imperial treasury, constantly drained by endless war, were more powerful than the ideological goal of destroying Britain. The financial damage was not limited to France. It crippled Napoleon's entire network of vassal states, fostering a deep-seated desire for liberation fueled by economic hardship. The textile industries in Holland and Italy, for instance, were entirely reliant on British colonial cotton, and when the supply was cut off, factories shut down, workers starved, and the local economies plummeted into recession. This economic depression across Europe meant that when the Allied armies finally rose against Napoleon, they were welcomed not just as military liberators, but as economic saviors who promised to restore trade and prosperity. This fact is crucial. The cost of the blockade in terms of lost income, destroyed industries, and massive tribute payments acted as the financial bedrock of the final coalition against Napoleon, proving that his economic decisions turned populations against him long before his army was defeated. The $100 billion loss was not just in revenue. It was in loyalty and political stability, the two most valuable assets of any empire. The comparison is inescapable. While Napoleon attempted to control continental demand with military decrees, the British simply used their naval supremacy to facilitate new global supply chains, their access to the world's oceans acting as a financial pressure valve that Napoleon simply could not replicate or counter. The Bank of England, despite facing challenges, never truly ran out of gold, and British industry, powered by new markets in Brazil, the Caribbean, and India, found new avenues for growth, ironically thriving under the very policy designed to destroy it. This resilience proved that true imperial power in the 19th century was determined not by the size of one's army, but by the flexibility and reach of one's treasury and trade network. Napoleon's attempt to destroy Britain financially became his own financial guillotine, demonstrating that no military force, however dominant, can long ignore the fundamental laws of economics and supply. This exploration has established the financial catalyst, the blockade, and its immediate catastrophic effects on imperial revenue and internal economic stability, forcing Napoleon into politically destabilizing acts of enforcement and ultimately leading to the Russian disaster. The catastrophic failure of the Continental Blockade was compounded by Napoleon's inability to grasp the concept of financial velocity and maritime market flexibility, concepts Britain had mastered over centuries of global trade. While the French emperor could enforce his will across continental customs houses, he could not stop British merchants from simply diverting their massive inventory of manufactured goods and colonial commodities, sugar, tea, and most critically cotton, to alternative, booming markets in the Mediterranean, South America, and North Africa. The volume of British exports to these non-European markets surged, effectively compensating for the European losses and stabilizing the British economy, demonstrating the financial resilience of a naval power. Napoleon had calculated that Europe was Britain's only viable market, a colossal error that underestimated the true reach of the Royal Navy and the Bank of England's global financial network. This global pivot meant that the very economic pressure Napoleon intended to exert was entirely defused, leaving the continent to suffer the consequences of isolation while Britain thrived on new trade wins. The blockade's structural flaw created a massive internal currency crisis within the French sphere of influence, further complicating Napoleon's ability to finance his armies. The drastic drop in customs duties, which were paid in hard currency, gold and silver, meant the imperial treasury was starved of the necessary metallic reserves. This forced Napoleon to increasingly rely on debased currencies and promissory notes, and to demand payments from vassal states in goods or soldiers rather than cash, devaluing the financial integrity of his entire system. As the blockade continued, the price difference between goods legally sold within the empire and the same goods smuggled from Britain became so vast that it created a powerful incentive for corruption at the highest levels. Imperial marshals, governors of port cities, and even members of Napoleon's own family, notably his brother Louis, the King of Holland, engaged in or tolerated massive smuggling operations, personally enriching themselves while undermining the emperor's law. This systemic corruption was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the direct, measurable interest payment on Napoleon's impossible economic decree, proving that financial law, when divorced from market reality, is inherently unenforceable. The most damaging financial ripple effect of the blockade was the destruction of the cotton industry in continental Europe, an industry vital to the economies of Italy, Switzerland, and the Confederation of the Rhine. Cotton, essential for textile production, came almost exclusively from colonial sources shipped by the British. When this supply was cut off, factories that employed thousands across Europe ground to a halt, leading to widespread unemployment, social unrest, and a massive loss of local tax revenue for Napoleon's dependent states. This economic depression was a far greater long-term threat than any military skirmish, as it eroded the popular support and financial stability of the local regimes Napoleon had installed. Napoleon, rather than addressing the core supply problem, attempted to solve it with decrees, mandating the planting of inferior substitutes and forcing factories to remain open without raw materials, actions that only accelerated the financial ruin and generated even deeper hostility among the merchant and working classes. This financial crisis profoundly altered Napoleon's relationship with his key allies, transitioning them from willing partners to reluctant debtors. Prussia, Austria, and the minor German states found themselves trapped between the necessity of trading with Britain for their survival and the military threat of French occupation for noncompliance. Their economies were forced to endure ruinous trade isolation, while simultaneously being required to provide crippling tributes, in money and men to finance Napoleon's wars. This dual pressure, economic strangulation coupled with military exploitation, ensured that these states were merely waiting for the opportune moment to defect. The financial policy of the blockade did the political groundwork for the final coalition against Napoleon, cementing their resolve to break free from his economic tyranny. The financial cost of being Napoleon's ally ultimately outweighed the cost of fighting him, a colossal miscalculation in imperial management. The invasion of Russia in 1812, the pivot point of Napoleon's career, was therefore primarily a financial war of enforcement. Tsar Alexander I's decision to resume trade with Britain in 1810 was a direct response to the Russian treasury's collapse, as the ban on timber and grain exports to Britain had destroyed the nation's revenue base. Napoleon viewed this resumption of trade not just as a political slight, but as a direct financial threat to the entire blockade system, fearing that if Russia could violate the decree, the rest of Europe would follow, leading to a total collapse of his financial leverage. The massive army Napoleon assembled, the Grande Armée, was mobilized to force Alexander back into the blockade to protect his economic policy more than to gain new territory. The disastrous march to Moscow was thus fueled by the imperative to restore customs revenue and enforce the unsustainable financial law, proving that even the most celebrated military campaign can be triggered by a desperate scramble for cash and trade enforcement. The economic failure of the blockade was the original sin that led to the military catastrophe in the snows. Furthermore, the blockade led to a significant misallocation of imperial capital that would have devastating long-term effects. Instead of investing in French infrastructure, education, or technological advancement, Napoleon was forced to spend colossal sums on the customs administration, establishing a massive bureaucracy of coastal patrols, officials, and inspectors whose sole purpose was to enforce the increasingly porous trade ban. This expenditure was both ineffective, given the rampant smuggling, and fiscally irresponsible, draining resources from genuinely productive sectors of the French economy. The money spent attempting to police trade isolation could have been used to solidify French financial power or improve the loyalty of the French populace. This misallocation highlights Napoleon's inability to shift priorities from military and regulatory control to sound economic management, a failing that contrasts sharply with the Bank of England's quiet, disciplined focus on maintaining its gold reserves and developing new financial instruments during the same period. The ultimate financial paradox remains. The British public, the intended victims, suffered less from the blockade than the subjects of the French Empire. Britain, a free market naval power, could adapt and find new markets, proving the resilience of an open global trade system. Napoleon's empire, a command economy run by military fiat, was brittle, inflexible, and easily shattered by the invisible forces of supply and demand. The blockade became an involuntary economic experiment that proved definitively that maritime financial power was the true currency of the 19th century world, not the temporary dominance of a land army. The $100 billion mistake was the belief that a bayonet could replace a balance sheet, and that a continental empire could survive without access to the global oceans. The final coalition against Napoleon was built on shared military aims, but its financial foundation was the universal desire of European merchants and treasuries to see the blockade end and trade resume. We have now established the blockade's internal economic destruction, its role in accelerating the Russian invasion, and its creation of systemic corruption and financial instability across the entire French imperial network. But the final, crushing details of Napoleon's personal debt and his failed attempt to raise revenue through the sale of American territory remain to be explored. The increasing desperation caused by the Continental Blockade forced Napoleon into a series of financial maneuvers that contradicted his own imperial ideals, revealing the deep structural panic within the imperial treasury. The most famous and ironic of these transactions was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which, while preceding the formal blockade decree, perfectly illustrates Napoleon's prioritization of immediate military funding over long-term imperial assets. Facing the need for massive funds to prepare for renewed conflict with Britain and having already exhausted the resources from previous military campaigns, Napoleon chose to sell the vast Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million, a sum that, while significant, represented a fraction of the land's actual value and potential future wealth. This decision was a colossal financial error from a long-term imperial perspective, effectively liquidating a massive future revenue stream for a short-term cash injection, a clear indication that the emperor was already struggling to manage his finances without resorting to unsustainable sales. The money from this sale was immediately funneled into his war chest, demonstrating that Napoleon's military expansion was always predicated on an underlying financial fragility, constantly requiring extraordinary measures to fund the next campaign, a cycle of debt and liquidation that the blockade only worsened. The blockade also created an entirely new class of immensely wealthy individuals, the smugglers and licensed profiteers, who became powerful economic actors operating outside the law. These individuals, often working with tacit approval from corrupt French officials, controlled the flow of essential goods like colonial sugar, spices, and British finished textiles. By controlling the scarcity, they could charge exorbitant prices, accumulating vast fortunes while the imperial treasury starved. This wealth disparity was profoundly destabilizing, as it alienated the loyalist merchant class who adhered to the blockade and fueled popular resentment against a regime that seemed to reward corruption while punishing obedience. Napoleon, in a further act of financial self-sabotage, often attempted to seize the profits and assets of these smugglers, not to stop the illegal trade, but to refill his own coffers. Yet this erratic enforcement only drove the black market deeper underground and increased the level of bribes required to operate, cementing the blockade's role as the single greatest engine of financial corruption in the empire. The most direct indicator of the blockade's internal failure was the state of the French national debt. While Napoleon famously boasted that he had paid off the national debt, a claim that was technically true only because he relied on external sources to fund his government, the truth was that he had merely externalized it, transferring the financial burden onto conquered territories and vassal states through massive, non-negotiable tributes. This transfer of debt was inherently volatile, as the stability of the imperial finances was entirely dependent on the continued military dominance over these reluctant financiers. The moment Napoleon's armies suffered a major defeat, the vassal states would cease payments, and the financial structure of the empire would instantly collapse, which is precisely what happened after the retreat from Moscow. The lack of a stable, domestically funded financial base meant the empire had no economic shock absorbers, making it fatally vulnerable to prolonged conflict or political dissent. The blockade's greatest cultural impact was on the European diet and habits, forcing consumers into uncomfortable and often expensive substitutions, further diminishing popular support for the French hegemony. The ban on tropical commodities like cane sugar led to the promotion of beet sugar, which required huge, expensive government subsidies to become viable, draining the treasury while failing to fully satisfy the market. The high cost of coffee led many to switch to expensive local herbal substitutes, and a lack of decent quality cotton drove up the price of clothing. These daily, personal economic hardships imposed by the blockade served as constant, irritating reminders of French rule, making the eventual Allied liberation not just a political victory, but a tangible economic relief for millions of ordinary Europeans. Napoleon attempted to control consumption and taste through decree, but the market fought back, making the everyday financial reality a form of quiet, persistent rebellion against the empire. Furthermore, the blockade created immense pressure on the French banking system. The commercial stagnation of the major port cities led to a wave of bankruptcies among merchants and banks reliant on overseas trade. The French state was often forced to intervene to bail out or prop up these failing institutions, drawing further on the dwindling central reserves. While the Bank of France managed to avoid a complete collapse, the continuous financial fragility of the commercial sector meant that Napoleon could not rely on his domestic capital markets to raise necessary war funds, forcing him back to the unsustainable reliance on conquest and tribute. This lack of financial depth and the reliance on brute force taxation contrasted sharply with the stable, market-driven financing mechanisms available to the British government through the highly organized and sophisticated Bank of England and the London financial markets, illustrating the fundamental difference between a mercantile financial power and a military command power. The ultimate military disaster in Russia in 1812 was the moment the blockade's financial flaws turned into a fatal military collapse. The sheer cost of maintaining the Grande Army, 500,000 men, in the Russian interior, combined with the loss of customs revenue from Russia, pushed the imperial treasury past the breaking point. The massive financial strain of equipping and supplying that force, without the guaranteed tribute from Russia or the flow of customs revenue, meant the empire was financially overleveraged and could not absorb the loss of the army. When the Grande Army was destroyed, the financial structure supporting the entire imperial edifice evaporated almost instantly, as the vassal states, Prussia, Austria, and others, knew Napoleon could no longer enforce the tribute demands or the blockade, prompting their immediate financial and military defection to the Allied side. The failure of the blockade to financially destroy Britain led to the Russian invasion, and the financial cost of that invasion led to the military end of the empire. The $100 billion mistake was a self-fulfilling prophecy of destruction. This analysis shows that Napoleon's fate was sealed not by the incompetence of a general in the field, but by the arrogance of an emperor who believed he could dictate economic law without understanding economic reality, an error that created a colossal financial liability that his military might could never offset. The blockade stands as one of history's clearest examples of how economic policy can be the true architect of imperial destruction, forcing political and military actions that lead directly to ruin. We have explored the blockade's genesis, its internal chaos, and its role in the Russian disaster. We now proceed to the final details of the blockade's immediate aftermath and the ultimate financial lessons learned. The aftermath of the Russian campaign exposed the total financial fragility of the Napoleonic Empire, turning the slow economic rot caused by the Continental Blockade into a rapid political collapse. As the remnants of the Grande Army straggled back across Europe, the financial pressure instantly became unbearable. The vassal states, having suffered years of crippling tribute demands and trade isolation, immediately ceased payments to the imperial treasury and began to actively join the Sixth Coalition, viewing the collapse of Napoleon's military as the long-awaited opportunity for economic liberation. Prussia, whose treasury had been decimated by French demands and the blockade, was one of the first to defect, motivated significantly by the desire to restore profitable trade with Britain. This cascade of financial defaults across Europe meant that when Napoleon attempted to raise a new army in 1813 to fight the final campaigns in Germany, he lacked the hard cash and reliable credit necessary to equip, feed, and pay his troops effectively, a stark contrast to the financially robust British-backed coalition forces. The blockade had an insidious long-term impact on the development of continental industry, particularly when compared to Britain. While Napoleon enforced trade isolation, he inadvertently protected some nascent, inefficient continental industries, creating a false sense of security. When the blockade was finally lifted after his defeat, these subsidized industries were immediately exposed to fierce, cheaper competition from the highly efficient, mass-producing British factories, which had been refining their methods in global markets throughout the blockade years. This sudden competition caused a wave of bankruptcies across Europe, further cementing the economic advantage of Great Britain and ensuring that the financial legacy of the blockade was not merely a temporary hardship, but a structural impediment to continental industrialization for the next generation. Napoleon's financial gamble had failed to destroy Britain's industrial base, but had successfully stunted the growth of his own economic sphere, proving that isolationism is an effective tool for self-sabotage. One of the final, desperate financial maneuvers employed by Napoleon during the collapse was the attempt to seize the assets of the Hamburg Bank, one of Europe's most stable financial institutions. Suspecting the bank was facilitating payments to Britain, Napoleon ordered a military seizure, but the bank's officials, anticipating the move, had secretly moved the majority of its gold and silver assets out of the city, forcing the French to accept promissory notes and devalued paper currency. This act of brazen financial theft further destroyed any remaining trust in French imperial finances, confirming to the European financial community that the emperor's regime was no longer a reliable or legitimate economic partner. This incident was a small, yet powerful symbol of Napoleon's final, frantic abandonment of sound financial practice in favor of brute force, highlighting the terminal decline of his economic authority across Europe. The blockade also ensured that the ultimate financial structure of the post-Napoleonic world would be dictated by Britain. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the victorious powers established a new European order, but the negotiations were underpinned by British financial stability. Britain, which had consistently funded the coalitions against Napoleon, emerged from the conflict not only with its navy and global trade networks intact, but also as the world's most powerful creditor nation. This financial strength gave London massive diplomatic leverage, ensuring that the new European borders and trade agreements favored their interests and permanently guaranteed the free flow of maritime trade, effectively reversing all of Napoleon's protectionist economic policies. The final, formal victory over Napoleon at Waterloo was achieved by combined military action, but the sustained financial power of Britain was the silent engine that enabled the coalitions to keep fighting year after year, demonstrating that sustained credit and a sound treasury were the ultimate determinants of the conflict's outcome. The true cost of the Continental Blockade, exceeding what would be $100 billion today in lost trade, ruined industries, and massive tribute demands, was the cost of over-leveraged ambition. Napoleon's attempt to dictate economic reality by military force was a fundamental misjudgment that ignored the resilience of global markets and the power of financial instruments. He fought a conventional war with extraordinary genius, but he fought the economic war with catastrophic incompetence, failing to understand that the economic health of his empire was the ultimate foundation for his military success. When his economic policy failed, his military structure crumbled, proving that the strength of a currency and the stability of a trade route are more enduring than the momentary triumph of an army. This historical case study stands as a chilling testament to the fact that no political or military leader, however powerful, can wage a sustained war against the fundamental laws of supply, demand, and global finance without ultimately ensuring their own destruction. We have now meticulously detailed the financial anatomy of Napoleon's self-inflicted collapse, from the initial misguided decree to the final seizure of assets, revealing that the blockade was the financial bomb that detonated his empire. The financial details of this story are now fully revealed, but the final judgment rests with you. What do you think? Was the fall of the empire really due to military defeat, or was the financial truth hidden on purpose to protect the reputation of those in power? Comment below and share your thoughts on the most significant financial betrayal of the 19th century.